past July, I started a Nevermore Notes book club, and we're reading different classic Gothic novellas each month. The goal is to pick a public domain, shorter classic Gothic work that we can all talk about in the book club together. And the reason I want it to be public domain is so that it is low investment both financially and also time-wise, hence the novella shorter length. And the club has voted for our August read, which is going to be Carmilla. If you want to join us on this classic sapphic vampire read that predates Dracula, feel free to check out the link in the description to the book club down below. There is an opportunity through the Fable app to talk about the book as you read it, chapter by chapter, so there's no spoilers. And at the end of the month, I do set up a virtual meet through Google Meet where we can all get together and talk about what we read. But before I get too excited about Carmilla, I do want to close out our first read, Turn of the Screw by Henry James, using this channel's standards for what makes something Gothic. As a reminder, we have 9 elements that we could explore, and you only need 3 to qualify. And from this point forward, spoilers for a 120-year-old book. Though I'm going to be light on details, there is at least one point in this script where I know I'm talking about the ending of this book. Starting with horror elements. I would say not in 2025, but I am positive this was a horror read for most people in 1889 when it first published. I just think that we have gone way beyond what we expect from supernatural, ghostly description and reads. We want the ghosts to feel very otherworldly, very separate from our mundane life. We need them doing something kind of like insidious for us to know like that the ghosts are up to no good. Where I think like Victorian times were just a little bit simpler. The existence of ghosts at all was kind of a bad thing, and they sort of accepted almost any take on the supernatural, even if they look like normal ass people. Maybe they even found that to be scary in and of itself because you wouldn't necessarily be able to discern who is a real person and who is a ghost. To be fair, when Turn of the Screw is modernized like it was in 2020's The Turning, I can sort of recognize the horror a little bit more readily. For example, sending a relatively sheltered and inexperienced woman to go take care of someone else's children, and for her to have no one she can reach out to if things go wrong, is kind of scary. And I think it's a very relatable fear, not just that you're in over your head with a child or children and have no recourse to help, but also like if you look at it from a job perspective, I think we've all been assigned a task, maybe even been excited to do that task and gotten into it and realized that we were in way over our heads and not really known what to do from there. And to that end, I kind of get why we are scared for the governess and for the kids, even if I don't necessarily think the ghosts are doing the most when it comes to actually giving me a sense of chills. I said it before and I'll say it again, children are often a great focal point for like driving home fear, tension, and stakes because they're often thrown into a situation against their will in which they cannot get themselves out of. They're just like innocent bystanders to a whole series of tragedies and circumstances that they can't do anything about, and they're really relying on their guardian to take care of them. So when you have not just one, but 2 children that are relying on a governess who appears to be unraveling before our eyes, or minimally appears to be unqualified for the task, it can set stakes very high right away. There is some weird like classism stuff and familiarity slash sexual stuff that I think is meant to make readers be on edge. Miss Gross is very concerned about how the previous governess, Miss Jessel, and the head of the horses or some kind of servant or whatever, Quinn, sort of crossed class lines and had a romance that appeared to be at first consensual and then to go further than Jessel wanted, and Jessel seemed to be sort of like fleeing from it in her escape from the castle to visit family over the Christmas holidays. Introduces both a class element that I don't think we necessarily jive with today and a element of dominance and sexual power that we are very afraid of and often sort of find their way into horror stories. There's also the question of how much time Quint spent with Miles and what was he doing during that time. That could be read just as like a straight inappropriate amount of attention, time, and influence on someone who was technically his better, since Miles was like a superior superior breeding stock to Quint, or that could have been like some kind of implication that something more nefarious was going on that could have, like, you know, traumatized Miles and really kicked this horror off in its own sort of way. And lastly, there is this like lingering question of what did Miles do to get himself kicked out of school? And there's a whole host of horrors there that we could explore. It could simply be that he was stealing people's letters, as Mrs. Gross suggests. It could be that he called a student names, as Miles says. It could be related to his alone time with Quinn and like some of the homosexual subtext that some scholars read into the work. Which brings in a whole fear of queerness that gets explored throughout horror historically with like its own baggage we could talk about. Whether or not you think that it's just Miles was homosexual, or if you think that Miles was playing out something that happened to him between him and Quinn. Those are different kinds of horror, different kinds of reveals too. All of these ambiguous, left unsaid notes in the work does leave the opportunity for horror mostly of your own creation. Next will be Character is King. And I do think the novel makes an attempt, but I'm gonna have to say no overall. Henry James was really trying to do something because we're reading the governess's letters, and so we're at a very close first-person perspective with her. I think we were supposed to get a very strong sense of her and a strong sense of like all of the people at play, at least from her perspective. It's also alienating. Like her responses, her like leaps of conclusion are unknowable and strange to me. Mrs. Gross is another character that feels at once both overly familiar and too removed from her. Her description of the children, while in line with how Victorian times sort of like portrayed women just loving children, again, feels strange and off-putting, and like these children could be any children in any place. There's an entire prologue set up and dedicated to making us feel like this governess is really a survivor and a victim in all of this, that she is a good woman, clever and brave, and someone worthy of love and adoration even despite this tragedy that happened. But because we don't ever circle back and we just get like this one dude was kind of in love with his sister's teacher, it's weird. It's like he had a crush on her and then retroactively learned this information and felt bad for her. I would say overall it's like an A for effort and just like an F in outcome. And I don't know if I'd feel differently if I had read it in its time, but as a modern reader, it's too opaque and I just can't see it, leading me into more poetic prose. This is 100% a yes. The narrative style that's chosen here, the close first-person perspective using an epistolary style where we're reading her letters, is all not common at all for its time frame and highly experimental. And this like first-person narration using other people's letters and journals to tell the story like this is all sort of like a classic Gothic staple at this point. So I would say that even though it's not executed at its highest level here, was effective enough that people continue to emulate and perfect it going forward. I do think there was a lot of room for improvement. Like personally, the ending here is very abrupt and a little flat, and what I needed to really like fully cement the wrapping is for the story to finish and for us to get another chapter where this like Victorian crew that's gathered and listening to this dude read these papers responds. Maybe like some follow-ups about what the presumed cause of death was for Miles, or like some follow-up on how they interpreted the story or what kind of questions they asked. Not only would that be more illuminating to how people at the time would have understood this story and would be great for me as a modern reader in that regard, but it would also just help make sense of like all this ambiguity that's left in the story. And I think if something like Turn of the Screw was written today, there would be like that close to the wrapper loop where we'd figure out how these people have reacted to the story they just listened to around the fire, or like maybe we'd get an explanation for why this guy decided to publish the story after the fact. Leading us into a sense of loneliness and longing, the isolation at Bly Manor is intense. This sort of isolation is probably normal in its time frame for people who lived out in the country like you would at Bly Manor, but it doesn't change the fact that there's nobody the governess can reach out to and no authority she can seek to help her when she falls under duress. And I do think there's like an added layer here because you might write to your employer and ask for help, or write to your employer to explain a situation, and she's been ordered to never contact this uncle. Even though she's in over her head, even though bad things are happening, she she can't reach out to this one person who might be able to offer assistance because he told her not to. And honestly, having a friend like Mrs. Gross is like worse than having no friend at all in some ways, because Mrs. Gross goes along and agrees with everything the governess proposes, even when there is no proof that what the governess is saying is true, and in fact what Mrs. Gross sees directly contradicts the assertions the governess is making. She still believes the governess's story, still goes along with it, still supports her. And like on one side I'm like, that's a ride or die friend, but on the other side, if you're having some kind of mental breakdown, a yes man is the last thing you need. And I do think Mrs. Gross's help or like companionship creates a fever pitch frenzy here that really brings things to a boiling point faster and more intensely than they would have otherwise. A focus on human mortality. The whole premise of the story is these two children's lives are in peril, and on top of that there's the specters of several deaths we're dealing with. For starters, these children came into the uncle's care because both parents died in India, and the governess is here because the previous governess, as well as the previous guy who I guess was in charge of the house, have died. Now she's gonna be both of those people. And of course, previous governess Miss Jessel and Quint are the ghosts that are haunting these children and want them for whatever reason. So like the fact that they are dead is the only reason they're able to torment these people. And the question of afterlife and tortured spirits and all that stuff is very prevalent in the fact that these ghosts are walking among the living, do want these children for some reason, possibly to possess them so they can live again, which like suggests a certain horror inherent in death or a horror inherent in their untimely demise. And of course, if these ghosts succeed in possession or succeed in taking these children, that spells an end for these children. A life taken so young is especially tragic to people. Like, I don't feel like I need to explain that any further. It's very gothic and very focused on like the cycle of life, death, mortality. I think the ending, more than anything else, really hammers home the idea of human mortality, because the governess is hell-bent on keeping these children from being possessed or taken by the ghosts or whatever. She sends Flora off and saves her that way, but her and Miles remain at the manor and she faces off with Quint. And even though she successfully is able to repel Quint, in the process of doing that, Miles dies. And that brings up like a question of whether or not Miles would be better off dead than being possessed. All of these questions are sort of left to linger with readers in a very abrupt ending. And since Flora is saved through leaving Bly Manor, it calls into question the governess's choice to keep Miles at Bly Manor. If everybody had fled in that moment, would both children have been saved from these ghosts? And if yes, then there's this aspect of it where the governess takes on a little bit of like an Adam and Eve role, because the reason she keeps Miles back is she wants to know information from Miles and thinks he'll break if it's just the two of them together in a room, that he maybe even wants to confess. So like this hunger for information, the same way Eve's temptation for knowledge got her to eat the apple and damn everyone, the governess holds on to Miles and it ends up killing Miles. Rolling us into a supernatural element, it really depends on how you read this story, and I think for most modern audiences the answer is probably no. But as far as like the traditional intention of the story, it seems very clear the answer is yes for Henry James and Victorian readers. For starters, psychology wasn't a field at this time, with Freud's psychological theory coming into existence and popularity after this was published, so there's no way that James was intentionally taking psychological elements. And also, none of James's other works have someone who's psychologically unwell like you would see in something like Edgar Allan Poe's works. That would indicate that they're supposed to be mentally unwell or unreliable in some way, which means we are supposed to take this governess's experiences and words literally, as truly and actually happening, and as her as a reliable and trustworthy witness. You know, as someone who reads a lot of supernatural horror, I think the execution is lacking here. As I said before, the ghosts are not scary, they're very mundane, and this is not something that is inherent in Victorian times. Certainly you can see like Charles Dickens or even some of Henry James's peers doing great supernatural horror. And I think maybe if we had gotten a little bit more reasoning why the ghosts had come to Bly, since they didn't die at Bly Manor, they died outside of the manor, they didn't live there, but for some reason the ghosts came back to haunt, I would have liked that. Maybe even if we had attached it to the children, if we could have given more of a reason why they wanted the children or what they intended to do with the children, children, like if we'd spelled out a possible possession aspect or something else there, maybe like a particularly maternal and paternal bond with each one of the respective children that are making them cling to life, these kinds of elements would have really helped elevate the horror. Also, if the ghosts were doing something scary and not just like standing there looking like a person, except we know they're ghosts, that would have helped. To be perfectly fair to Henry James, I do think his descriptions within this novel were true to his own personal experience. He wrote this when he was older and after both his sister and one of his writer friends had passed, and he writes in a letter to somebody else that he sees ghosts everywhere. And I do wonder if he meant specifically the ghosts of these people who had passed and that he just saw them in places where they usually would have frequented together, just as real and as lifelike as you or me, rolling us into questioning a character's mental health and reality. You know, as I said at the top, definitely not at the time, but part of what has given this novel its sticking power besides its ambiguity is the different ways we can interpret it. And in the 1930s, one literary analysis that gained popularity applied Freud's theories very point by point to the governess. For us in modern days is also pretty cringe because we don't really jive with Freud psychology anymore. But there still are a lot of things that are very ambiguous to a modern audience because the governess is the only one who ever sees the ghost. There is this one time when Flora, Mrs. Gross, and the governess is all there. The governess is pointing at the ghost. Flora denies the ghost, and the governess explains this away as Flora lying. But Mrs. Gross also doesn't see the ghost, and now the governess explains this away as it being only she has been chosen to see the ghost, and the Mrs. Gross doesn't have the spiritual warfare ability to handle this, and she's suffering in the children's places. The way she keeps justifying these delusions really feels like a schizophrenic break from reality. And the governess is young and naive and at a time period where that kind of break might make sense for her, in her life if she had schizophrenia. Beyond that, there's more going on in the governess's life than just this job that she's underqualified for, which in and of itself is putting pressure and strain on her. She does mention in passing at least once that there were letters coming to her from home that have bad news in them. So there's stress of some kind of family trouble going on. When she comes to Bly, she sees herself in a full-length mirror and mentions this is the first time she's ever seen a full-length mirror. So that sort of gives us an indication of how unworldly she is, how out of her depth she might be at Bly Manor. And she mentions that she is not qualified to teach Miles, and Miles is a 9-year-old boy. So her schooling is not that high even though we're calling her a governess. All of which means that it's not too big a leap for most modern audiences to see this as some kind of delusion or break from reality where unfortunately the governess ends up smothering Miles and then having this elaborate fantasy that explains it all away. I'm not counting it because it's definitely not Henry James's original intention, but I did want to discuss it a little bit because it's very relevant to modern reader experience with this particular classic. Makes use of local folklore, superstition, and myth? I would tentatively say no. But while talking to my book group, there were some interesting points on this topic I kind of wanted to highlight. Because there is some argument for the forces of good and evil battling it out in this story. Starting with the absentee uncle, who's ever present in how Mrs. Gross and the governess talk about him, but never makes a real in-person appearance at Bly Manor. Arguably, this uncle's absence, as the strong protector and the person who's supposed to be head of the household, is what lets this evil lurk in. If you take it literally that there are ghosts and these ghosts are evil and are trying to take the children, his absence is what allows that, as well as him hiring unqualified people. And if you take it as the governess having a psychological break and killing Miles, again, he hired someone who was mentally unstable and gave her no resources. So his absence and his demand to not be involved is what resulted in Miles's death. There's something to that because, there is that often paraphrased saying, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. And you might argue that the governess was doing everything she could think of to try and combat this evil. And I'd say we were given all of the clues that she was unqualified and incapable to do battle with this evil in like a meaningful way and triumph. We have already talked about her being a woman, her being naive and innocent, and her being inexperienced, and this being a job that would be overwhelming for someone in her experience range. But another thing you could notice in this story is the one and only place these people go to is church, and the 2 times everyone goes to church, the governess misses it. First, she goes back in for her glove, and that's when she sees Quint in the window looking for Miles. And instead of going to church with the others, she sends them off and remains to think about Quint and think about what she can do on the ghosts, which you could say is like the evil itself distracting her and stopping her from seeing spiritual warfare, a spiritual leader who could help deliver her from evil. And then the second time, she is like at the church's steps when she turns away and goes like into a frenzy thought or whatever, because Miles decides to confront her for the first time about the fact he hasn't returned to school. And when is he going back to school? And why isn't he with his own kind? And we can see this as potentially like Quint's possession of Miles taking a further grip on him, and Quint using Miles to upset the governess in a way that will either make her flee, which she does consider doing at this juncture, or just minimally make her miss church and therefore continue to weaken her to the presence of evil and weaken her ability to fight the evil that's encroaching. It's not something I would have come up on my own. I'm really glad that our book group brought it up, and I thought it was just like an interesting tidbit to share, even if I'm not personally going to give it the Gothic point this time. And then last but not least is a strong sense of place, and I would have to say unfortunately not, which is really disappointing. When you hear Turn of the Screw, you think you're going to get a very classic haunted house ghost kind of story, and the house is going to have like all of this character and description. You're going to get to hear like the wind going through it, like the house is breathing, there's going to be all these bumps and groans in the night. The ghosts are kind of going to be like appearing and disappearing in there in a really scary and evocative way, and we just do not use this setting to its best degree. I really got no sense of personality from the home. I didn't feel like the home was enhancing this haunting or even connected to the ghosts in any way, shape, or form. It just lacks those particularly descriptive moments or sense of tension that you would get if the house got to be its own character. So to wrap this all up, I would say the Turn of the Screw has 5 of the 9 Gothic elements, which firmly places it within the realm of Gothic literature. I think for modern readers, it's only middle of the road reading-wise. It lacks a lot of the things we've come to expect. While we can see a lot of influences and inspiration that more modern Gothic works take from Turn of the Screw, I think overall a strange pacing in this novella, combined with a too mundane portrayal of the supernatural and a very abrupt, ambiguous ending, make this hard to recommend to the modern audience. There's just so much that I feel like you need more social context for and more research to really appreciate. It's short enough that I would recommend it to fans of Gothic literature for its history. There's definitely enough interesting discussion points that could be had here in its ambiguity that it's good for a book group. But if you're looking just for like fun Gothy time, something that's really rich in resonance, I don't know that this one will do it for you. But that's going to be my Gothic review of Turn of the Screw. Talk to me in those comments down below. Have you read this book? And what else would you add to my commentary? And our secret emoji will be a ghost in those comments down below. As always, keep reading.